Hello and welcome to episode 17 of What Makes This Song Special. By now, most of you know the protocol. Every week I take a different song. I talk about what that song reminds me of in my life, in my life story. I talk a wee bit about the singer of the song, do a wee bit of a vocal coach reaction to some of the techniques involved, and then I do a part 2 where I do my own cover version. So this week's song is going to be the 80s synth pop group Erasure's Love to Hate You, which was released in 1991. Great song, catchy melody. We'll talk about why it's a great song. We'll talk about why it's a special song to me and what it reminds me of in my life. So this week we're going back to around about 1997. I must have been about 15 at that point, and me and my best pal Michael had formed a band called Morph, MORF. So Michael Oakley, Rico Frankie would used our initials to make the name, and it was quite an apt name for the band considering we were both coming from sort of polar opposite places musically, morphing together. Me with my classic rock and guitar background, and Mike with his sort of synth loving, keyboard playing, Pet Shop Boys adoring one. So we've done a lot of talking about gigging by this point and becoming famous, as you do in your bedroom when you're a kid. You talk about when I become famous and when we make it, and I think we were all talk at that point, or I certainly was, but whereas Mike was always willing and prepared to dive into anything without fear. So I turned up at his house one morning to just hang out, and he announced to me that he'd got our first gig at a local church hall. It was Greenbank Church in Clarkston, which is actually the first place I ever sang live with the school choir when I was in primary school, primary 7. Never made that connection before. That was my first ever performance as a singer in a choir, and then also my first ever kind of gig. So anyway, this came to me there. But we had a couple of weeks to prepare, and at that point we were using MIDI, which MIDI's too complicated to explain on here. So if you're interested in what MIDI is, Google it. But we were using MIDI, which was basically a way of recording keyboards, and then you could choose the sounds after you'd recorded. As I say, Google it, you'll get a better explanation of that. But it was before you could record audio easily without going to an expensive recording studio. You could kind of do this if you had a PC in your house or some sort of basic computer. You could record with MIDI and a keyboard and a MIDI cable. So so we'd picked a few songs and decided who should sing lead vocal on each one, because Michael sang as well, and I was on guitar and Mike on the keyboard. And I think most of what we did was pre-recorded. We recorded most of it in Michael's bedroom with a couple of keyboards and some guitar parts, and so that we could concentrate on singing live. We weren't that confident at that point. There were a couple of original songs that Michael had written. This was before I don't think I'd written any songs at this point. I was maybe starting to write songs at this point. Michael had written a couple of really good songs, and we did a few cover versions, and that was our set. And we made sure to invite some girls from school to come and see us so that we could kind of show off. But we never told many other people about it, just in case they came and threw tomatoes at us. So by this point, I'd only really sung a couple of songs in front of classmates, maybe in music class at school at this point. So I think, see episode 1 for that story. Episode 1, I talk about that scary moment where I had to sing for the first time in front of somebody other than family. So I was still really nervous about singing live at this point. It was still something very daunting to me. And the one thing that jumps out actually when I think about this gig, I don't know why this jumps out more than the music. I remember that just before we went on, Michael had found this little water pistol that looked or was shaped like a plastic dinosaur. So it was a dinosaur, like a T-Rex or something, and you scooshed and it came out of the dinosaur's mouth, the water. So randomly in the middle of the gig, Michael, as you know, I've mentioned Michael in a couple of episodes already, It was always very random and very kind of did a lot of mad, crazy things. So between songs, he started shouting down the microphone, started shouting like the dinosaur water pistol. I don't know why he did but at the start of it he did. And then he started like scooshing water at various members at the front row of the audience. Completely bizarre, but that's what I always remember about that gig, probably more than the music. I remember that dinosaur water pistol. Anyway, the gig was a huge success, and the following week we were working hard on trying to improve our sound, as Michael had managed to land us a gig in Strathclyde University Student Union, which was a pretty big deal. That was a pretty big gig when you're 14, 15 years old. We managed to get a couple of fake ID cards, because you had to be 18 to get into the student union. And I think we got, there was these things at the time, other folk in Scotland will remember this, maybe not outside, but we had these things called Young Scot cards, and you basically get sent them out and you could get discounts off of things. If you were a young Scottish person, you could get these, or a young person living in Scotland, you got these cards, and you essentially were given this sort of carte blanche of being able to just write whatever you wanted on it, and then it had a sort of sticker that it turned into like a wee thing that looked like a credit card. So we managed to put different dates of birth on them, and I don't know why they let us in, because we definitely didn't look old enough to get in. But we definitely needed to up the quality of our set from the church hall gig, with some better sounds and things. And Michael knew a guy called Keith Jones. There's a guy called Keith Jones. I don't know how Michael met Keith, but Keith was a good few years older than us. At this point, he was maybe about 20, which obviously seemed like a lifetime older than us when we were just in our mid-teens. And he was into all the same kind of music as Michael. And Michael had assured me that he had dozens of classic synths and keyboards that we couldn't afford at this point. And that if we went to visit him, he could take our backing tracks to the next level by replacing some of the kind of general MIDI sounds that we'd used with some really good synth sounds. So Keith lived just outside Glasgow in a place called Cumbernauld, and Mike's dad, Jimmy, had promised to give us a lift over. So Jimmy had been a pretty well-known singer in the music scene when he was younger, and he still played in a lot of bands, and so he knew the drill. He would give us advice in the van when he was driving us places, and Mike would roll his eyes and sort of go, "Oh, we're not taking advice from you, Dad." Even though Jimmy had toured with the Beatles when he was younger, shared stages with the Drifters and other impressive, famous, legendary acts, but Mike didn't want to listen, the way that I suppose we all do with our parents when we're teenagers. We sort of ignore what they've got to say because we think we know it all at that point. So on this particular occasion, Jimmy was giving us a lift to Cumbernauld, as I said, and Mike's dad, he didn't have his usual van. He'd borrowed this old beaten up white transit van. I think it was a white transit from somebody to sort of tide him by. So I don't know whose van it was, but that's what Jimmy had. And it was parked on a hill round the corner from Michael's house because it wouldn't start unless it got a wee bit of momentum. So you had to sort of take the handbrake off, roll it down the hill and then start. So we got into the van. It was one of those vans where there was like a seat for the driver and then the passenger seats you could sort of strap in two people in a one. And so I'm looking for the seatbelt and I pull the seatbelt and it just keeps coming, like a comedy sketch seatbelt. And I realised it was held on with sellotape and just come away from the seat. So I thought, oh my God. So I'm holding on to the door, hoping we didn't crash. Not that I don't think the door would have really helped me, but you hold on to something when you're nervous in those situations, especially as Michael's dad, Jimmy, had said about 5 minutes into the journey that the brakes weren't really working very well and the car kept cutting out all the time mid journey. So Mike looked in the back at one point and sort of elbowed me, and he sort of went, look in the back, and I look in the back of this transit van, and it was full of nappies, like babies' nappies, like diapers for you Americans watching. So we didn't even bother asking what was going on, why the van was full of nappies. I remember on the motorway, about 5-10 minutes later, these signs kept flashing up that just kept saying fasten your seatbelt, and I was thinking, oh God, that's a sign. It's a sign that we're gonna we're going to die in this journey. It was dreadful. Anyway, we finally get to Keith's house in Cumbernauld, and I was introduced to him and his cousin Richard. I'm sure his name was Richard. And they all started talking about synths and synth bands. I felt completely out of place. I had no clue about these bands, other than the very sort of elemental knowledge that Michael had instilled in me from sort of sitting me down in his room and going, "Oh, have a listen to this Pet Shop Boys song," or whatever. So I was the guy who was into rock bands and hated synth, and yet here I was watching Michael and Keith play around with these classic synths and make them sound like the famous songs that they'd featured on. And it was exciting. It was exciting watching that. I remember I wanted to be able to play those parts. And I think that was one of the first driving forces behind me wanting my own keyboard and wanting to start to teach myself how to play piano. Because it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't my chosen music style, but and the icons of that world, no offence to anybody who loves the icons of that world, but the icons of that world weren't as cool, as, in my opinion, as the guys that were in the world of the music that I listened to. I listened to guys in classic rock bands like Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses and Bon Jovi with their tattoos and their long hair, and they looked tough and rock and roll and all that stuff. Whereas the 80s synth pop stuff, it just looked like kind of random folk you'd see walking down the street. They just didn't, I don't know, they didn't have that X factor for me. But the cool thing about that genre was that, I suppose what I realise now in retrospect is that when I played guitar at that point, and I wasn't great on the guitar at that point, I'd only been playing for a couple of years and I'd been teaching myself, the stuff that I loved to listen to and the guitar bands that I loved was unplayable. Unless you were a virtuoso on the guitar, you couldn't play the Bon Jovi guitar solos or the guitar solos that Slash played in Guns N' Roses. They were impossible. They were way above my level. Whereas this stuff seemed like you could learn it pretty quickly. If you had a few hours on a keyboard, you could probably, work out how to play the opening riff to Domino Dancing by Pet Shop Boys, or I don't know, Chorus by Erasure or something like that. You could work out these synth parts probably a lot easier than you could playing, 20 notes a second in some crazy guitar solo by Guns N' Roses. So I remember my dad had a little Yamaha sort of PSS or PSR kind of home keyboard that my mum had got him for Christmas one year, and I remember trying to find some synth sounds on there and replicate some of the ostinatos in the weeks that followed, wee hooks from these songs. And anyway, so I think Keith, at this point we're in Keith's, Keith or his cousin Richard's, had this bright, luminous blue car with one of those really noisy exhausts that people put on their car to make it sounds like they're faster cars than they are. And he took us for a spin to show us how fast the car went, and we were driving around all these roundabouts and roads in Cumbernauld where I'd never been before. I remember sitting in the back of the car praying for it to end, because as much as I was a bit of a daredevil when I was a kid, I didn't ever like it if it was that daredevil nature was out of my control. I liked to be the kid that was climbing the tree, but I was in control of that. Whereas sitting in the back of a car while somebody's racing about isn't fun. So anyway, we survived the car ride and recorded some great backing tracks and managed to get a loan of a really good PA system from Keith for the upcoming gig. And he said he'd come along and help us get set up and bring along some fans, some support for us, which was really cool. So on the night of the gig, I've no idea how anyone thought we were 18. I mean, even with the fake IDs, we looked and acted so young. I remember at the end of the night, we were given some free pints of lager as payment for the gig, and we just handed them out to the adults because we were just like wee kids. We were like, we're not drinking pints. It's like, it just seemed like such a kind of grown-up thing to do, drink a pint. So we were handing them out to people in the audience, our free. That was our payment, a few pints. But the gig was amazing, and to me and Michael, we just felt like we'd made it. It was full of students who liked watching live bands, and people were commenting on how good we were, and there must have been a couple of hundred people in the room, which was a huge gig to us at that point. It was really big, and it was just exciting, incredible feeling getting to experience something like that being born, and wondering where it was going to take us. It was the start of something, which was really cool. and they were great times. And I had a few songs that remind me of that time, because the songs that I sang in that set that night, I always remember that we did Every Breath You Take by The Police. Or these are the ones I sang anyway. The Show Must Go On by Queen, which is actually my favourite song of all time, if you're asking, which you weren't, but that is my favourite song of all time. I'll maybe cover it at some point on the channel. And Love to Hate You by Erasure, which is obviously today's song. And again, it's a great song. We'll talk about the song a little bit, but I actually sang it for one of my fourth year, just shortly after this, sang it for one of my fourth year exams at school, which looking back is it's a strange song to pick for an exam, like to sing an 80s pop song. Everybody else was doing musical theatre songs, and I pick Erasure, Love to Hate You. But I'm pretty sure I got an A for it, so it all worked out. But I think the most important thing to remember, just going back to the kind of morphing together of musical styles, and I think no matter whether a song is played on guitar or on a synth or on a trumpet or whatever it is, if it's country, classical, heavy metal, pop, a great melody is a great melody. And I think I was starting to realise that at this point. This was starting to allow me to broaden my musical horizons, not just thinking, right, it's not a guitar band with, guys with long hair and tattoos. I can't relate to that. I've started to relate to anything that had a good melody, and this song's definitely got a great melody. So I suppose it might have been the gateway into me opening my mind a little bit to some synth pop. And I don't think I ever became a huge synth pop fan, but there's a lot of songs in that genre that I do enjoy. So anyway, we'll talk about the song. The song was released, as I said, in 1991, even though it's got a very 80s synth pop vibe to it. It was written by Vince Clarke and Andy Bell, who are the two members of Erasure. Vince Clarke was a genius of that era. He wasn't just using great synths. He was using lots of great synths, but not just that. Vince was inventing sounds. He was inventing sounds and creating drum sounds, not always from samples, like just from noises that he managed to compose into something musical, and they sounded different. I think that's the great thing about the bands that he was in. He was in the early lineup of Depeche Mode as well, and then left to do his own thing and start. He started a band with Alison Moyet called Yazoo, not Yahoo, called Yazoo. Yazoo were just a duo synth pop duo. Alison Moyet with a wonderful voice, and he would have probably crossed paths with Steve Brown at that point as well, because Alison Moyet worked a lot with Steve Brown. Steve Brown being the producer that I mentioned in last week's episode. A wee plug for another episode. Have a listen to episode 16, was that? But then Vince went on to work with a few other artists before starting Erasure in 1985 with vocalist Andy Bell, who we'll talk about in a wee moment. But there's one thing I wanted to mention as well, something that Michael and I spoke about the other day. Mike lives in Canada now and is doing very well in the synthwave world, still writing synth tunes. I'll maybe leave a wee link somewhere to one of Michael's songs that you can have a listen to. But we spoke on the phone the other night, and I mentioned that I was going to cover this song. I was just telling him about the story and seeing if he remembered that day that we went over to Keith's house and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that Michael had told me about the song on the call was that he said that Vince Clarke actually, shortly after the song was released, he admitted that he'd sort of taken the chord sequence from Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive, because he always loved that song, and he sort of paid homage, as they say, to it as a song that he loved, So it led to us talking about what constitutes plagiarising, where's the line. Vince Clarke and Andy Bell were influenced by another song and then did something very different with the chord progression. Well, they took the chord progression, did something very different with the melody and the production, and then paid homage, as I said, to the original by admitting that I Will Survive was the source of inspiration for Love to Hate You. So is that ripping off a song? Is it stealing? Is that plagiarising? Or is that just, being influenced by something? A hero of yours, I suppose we all kind of can't help but emulate the people that we are influenced by, So let me know what you think in the comments. I want you to to hear people's opinions on that. What constitutes plagiarising. It's a good wee debate to have, and I sit on the fence with it. So anyway, as I said, Andy Bell was the other half of Erasure. He was the singer, and in my opinion, probably the best male voice of that era and genre. I don't remember any other singers from 80s synth pop bands having the technique, range and presence that Andy Bell had. Obviously, I said male singer because I know obviously Eurythmics had Eurythmics. It's a tongue twister, Eurythmics. Had Annie Lennox, and there was some great female singers of that era as well. But I think of the male singers of that genre, maybe Tony Hadley from Spandau Ballet also he's a great voice as well. Jimmy Somerville from Bronski Beat had a really unusual voice, but a really cool, great range and a really cool voice as well. I think they're honourable mentions, but I don't think they're in the same league as Andy Bell personally. And before you destroy me in the comments, I don't see Wham as being that genre. Or of course I would have mentioned George as being the greatest male singer of that era of pop, but I feel like Wham are a wee bit more pop and less of a synth act, although maybe I'm, I don't know, maybe I'm being unfair. But certainly Andy Bell had a great voice, an incredible range, and able to sing extremely low. I mean, notes that I can't even get anywhere near. There are notes in some of the songs. I'm sure there's a song called, is it Breath of Life or something like that, where he's like, it's incredible down to, yeah, I can't even think where it goes, but yeah, much lower than me, and then he's able to then move up high into his upper chest register with power, and also into great connected head voice notes, really nicely connected, closed glottis head voice notes, like the famous ones in the end of the chorus of A Little Respect, the to me, those bits, great at getting into his head voice, and they're really iconic melodies and iconic parts. Great use of support with his diaphragmatic breathing, really nice tonal placement and sort of post-phonation phase in the vocal tract, which led to him having a really nice and easy to listen to voice in general. So yeah, wonderful singer. I won't bore people with too much information on Andy Bell's vocal technique. If you want to learn more about vocal technique, you can get in touch and we can schedule a vocal lesson. But that's where the story ends, and that's where I suppose my wee kind of rundown on the song and the singer ends today. Yeah, so that song always, if I listen to Love to Hate You by Erasure, I always think back to, I suppose, that era, especially that day where we had, that night at the first gig with Strathclyde Student Union. It's a big gig, and going to Keith's house and learning about synth music, and I suppose being open to a world of a different genre of music, and just enjoying that journey, which was great fun. So that's what if I close my eyes and listen to Love to Hate You, that's what I remember. What does it mean to you guys listening, watching the video? Leave a comment. What does it make you think about? Why is it a special song? If it is, why is it a special song to you? What does it remind you of in your past? And as I said, open up a wee debate about plagiarising and all that type of stuff. And I will see you next week. Thanks so much for listening.